Have you ever seen an ad that just hits you right in the feels? You know, the one that feels like a warm hug from your childhood? That right there is nostalgia marketing. It's this powerful idea of tapping into our memories to make us connect with a brand. But does taking that trip down memory lane actually work? And here's a perfect example. Just look at Polaroid. On one side, you've got an ad that's leaning hard into this whole vintage is cool vibe with the old school fonts and classic cameras. Then on the other side, a super sleek, modern ad for their new stuff. It's the same company, but they're using two totally different psychological tools to get your attention. And trust me, that is no accident. So at its core, this whole strategy is about building an emotional bridge. It goes way deeper than just listing product features. The goal isn't to sell you a thing, it's to sell you a feeling, making a giant corporation feel as familiar and as trustworthy as an old friend. So here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with why brands are so obsessed with nostalgia in the first place. Then we'll ask a much deeper question that leads us to a really cool experiment. We'll look at how it was set up, uncover some data that is genuinely surprising, and then try to figure out what it all means.
Okay, first up, let's talk about the conventional wisdom here. Why is looking backwards such a popular strategy for trying to move products forward?
So why bother? Well, it's all about cutting through the noise. In a world with a million ads screaming for your attention, nostalgia helps build this unique emotional connection. It can make a brand feel warmer, more trustworthy, and like it actually means something to you personally. And honestly, in a sea of slick modern ads, a little touch of the past can really make you stand out.
Okay, this all sounds fantastic in theory, but it leads us to a much more interesting question. Is that pull of the past really the same for everybody? And here's where we get to the really important research gap. We've got studies that show, yeah, nostalgic ads can improve how attached people feel to a brand. But here's the thing. Almost no one has asked if this effect changes based on our cultural background. Specifically, does it work differently for someone with a more collectivist worldview versus an individualist one? And this study was designed to tackle that exact question.
And that brings us to the formal research question that's driving this whole experiment. It's really a two-part question. First, does nostalgia advertising actually increase brand attachment? And second, is that effect even stronger for people who have a more collectivist cultural orientation? You know, people who tend to place a higher value on group harmony and shared experiences. So from that big question, the researchers made two very clear predictions, or what we call hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 is pretty straightforward. It just says the nostalgic ad will work better than a neutral one. Simple enough. Hypothesis 2 is where it gets more nuanced. It predicts that this boost from the nostalgic ad will be even more powerful for people who score higher on that collectivism scale. Okay, so you've got your question, you got your predictions. How in the world do you actually design a test for something like this? Let's get into the experimental setup. The researchers used a classic setup called a between subjects experiment. Now, that just means that each of the 82 people in the study was randomly shown either the nostalgic ad or the neutral ad, but never both. So here's the journey each person went on. First, they were randomly put into one of the two groups. Next, they answered questions to measure their attachment to the brand. That's the key thing we're looking at. Then comes a really crucial step, a manipulation check, to see if the nostalgic ad actually felt nostalgic to them. After that, their cultural orientation was measured, and finally, just a few quick questions to make sure they were paying attention. All right, the experiment is done, the data's all collected. Now for the really exciting part. What did the numbers actually have to say? Before anything else, the researchers had to check, did their nostalgic ad actually make people feel more nostalgic? And the answer was, well, not really. People who saw the retro ad rated it as a little more nostalgic, sure, but the difference was so small it wasn't statistically significant. That p-value of 0.16 basically means there's a good chance that tiny difference was just random luck. Okay, so the manipulation was a little weak. But hey, maybe, just maybe, the nostalgic ads still managed to boost brand attachment anyway, right? This is the big test of our first hypothesis. Did the people who saw the retro ad feel more connected to the Polaroid brand? And the answer is a huge, resounding no. I mean, look at that p-value, 0.98. You really can't get much farther from significant. The average brand attachment scores for both groups were practically identical. So hypothesis 1, not supported. But wait, what about the culture angle? This is where it gets really interesting. This plot shows the results for our second hypothesis. The flat blue line is the neutral ad. It didn't matter what your cultural orientation was. But look at that black line for the nostalgic ad. For people low on collectivism on the left, it seems like it might have even lowered brand attachment. But for those high on collectivism on the right, it looks like it has a really strong positive effect. It seems like our hypothesis might be right after all.
Despite what our eyes are telling us on that graph, the formal statistical test for this came back with a p-value of 0.071. It is so close, but it's still not below that critical 0.05 threshold. So we can't confidently say that culture made a difference. Hypothesis 2 was also not supported.
So let's just lay out the final verdict from the evidence. The nostalgic ad didn't really make people feel more connected to the brand, and that effect was not significantly stronger for people with a collectivist worldview. In the court of data, that initial, really logical hunch was not supported. So, after all of that, none of the big ideas were supported. Was this experiment a failure? Absolutely not. In science, finding nothing is still finding something really important. So let's break down the valuable lessons we can actually learn from this.
There are a few key reasons that could explain these results. First, and this is probably the biggest one, the manipulation just failed. The nostalgic ad just wasn't nostalgic enough. Second, a sample size of 82 people is pretty small, especially when you're looking for subtle effects. The study just might not have had enough power. And finally, let's be real. Nostalgia is personal. What feels retro and cool to one person might not mean anything to someone else. So where does this all leave us? We started by asking if nostalgia sells, and it seems the answer isn't a simple yes or no. This experiment brilliantly shows the biggest challenge here. We all feel the pull of nostalgia, but proving that feeling in a lab is incredibly difficult. It tells us that for marketers, just slapping a retro font on an ad probably isn't enough.